This podcast is brought to you by Podcast Nation.
You are listening to As a Woman, episode 112, Endocrinology with Dr. Arti Thangudu. Dr. Arti is a highly skilled, triple board certified physician in endocrinology, diabetes, and metabolism. Today, we are talking all about the endocrine system and what you need to know about how your body works.
Welcome to As a Woman, the podcast hosted by fertility physician Dr. Natalie Crawford to educate and empower women. Each week, learn about your health, your fertility, and how they relate to your true self. Become a part of the community fostering collaboration over competition while learning how to authentically find your voice and amplify others as a woman.
Hi, friends. Welcome back to the As a Woman podcast. I am Dr. Natalie Crawford, fertility physician and your host. As always, thank you for being here. I love this podcast so much. I'm so proud of the place that it has become, and I'm super excited to talk to you about the endocrine system today. As you know, I am a reproductive endocrinologist. That means all the reproductive hormones and infertility. That's my specialty. I did 3 years of training in REI, that's a fellowship, after 4 years of OBGYN. And to make matters even interesting, I did a year of emergency medicine before I realized that women's health was my true passion and switched to OBGYN. But today we are coming at things from the medical endocrine side, and I'm so excited to have you here today. We are going to be talking to Dr. Arti Thangudu. She is fabulous. She is triple board certified in endocrinology, diabetes, and metabolism. She got her bachelor's degree in journalism from Northwestern. She received her medical degree from UT Health Science Center in San Antonio, did an intern year at Baylor, her residency in internal medicine and fellowship in endocrinology, diabetes, and metabolism. And that was all at Tulane. She's board certified in internal medicine, endocrinology, diabetes, metabolism, and lifestyle medicine. She previously worked at a really busy traditional endocrinology practice, but then she saw the light, decided to leave and be her own boss, and she started her own practice, Complete Medicine. We will talk some about that, but it is person-centered and an involved approach to patient care. She loves taking care of patients, making them empowered with education for their own journeys, and I am honored to call her a friend and so excited to have her here today. Arti, I'm so honored to have you here today. Thank you so much for joining us on the As a Woman podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Natalie.
So I've already told everybody a little bit about the difference in being a medical endocrinologist, what you are, and a reproductive endocrinologist, what I am. The truth is, I like to think of us both as the real hormone experts out there, and we manage different things at different times of your life. So I'm really excited to dive down into a little bit more of the medical endocrinology with you today, because I work hand in hand with a lot of endocrinologists here to take care of some of our patients who are having reproductive problems. But I'd love you to start by telling everybody how you ended up in endocrinology to begin with.
Yeah, absolutely. So I grew up with a bunch of metabolic disease all around me, and I didn't realize that it was shaping my future life and career decisions. When I was a kid, my grandparents lived with me. I had like a multi-generational family, and my grandfather had diabetes. So I grew up pricking his finger and kind of trying to tell him what to eat and what not to eat. And we have a lot of heart disease in my family. My dad actually had a heart attack when he was 37 and I was 3. Yeah. And so that, of course, shaped my life. He didn't die. Thankfully, he's still with us today, very much so. But all of this kind of led me on my pathway in medicine. I really thought about being a doctor who could care for my community. And my mom's actually an ophthalmologist. And I always, thought I would be like my mom, a surgical subspecialist. And then as I grew up, I really was interested in lots of different things and still managed to make my way to medicine. But I actually have a degree in journalism from Northwestern and did a lot of different things and realized that I really loved communication. And so I went to medical school, went into the OR and realized I don't belong here.
That's something you know or you don't know, right?
It totally is. I was just like, this is not my place. And I wanted the patients to wake up. And I was like, I didn't want to be operating on them because I wanted to talk to them. And so I really found myself flourishing on my internal medicine rotations. As I was looking through specialties, I just fell in love with endocrine. I loved talking to people, talking about their lives and getting to know them in these really meaningful ways, at least meaningful to me, and making an impact on them long term. And had some really, really great mentors. And yeah, that's how I landed here.
I love it. The endocrine system, I love it so much. It's complex, but it's like a puzzle. It makes a lot of sense. So it's one of those things, as a medical student even, it's really complicated and kind of overwhelming. And I know for a non-medical person, it's very overwhelming also. But when we get to the point and you understand it, it's like a big puzzle in my brain that all the pieces really fit together. And part of how I view my job, and I know you view yours the same way, is trying to help other people understand that puzzle so that it's not just we're throwing medications at everything or giving you these willy-nilly recommendations. We're really trying to help you understand how your body can function the best and make choices along that way. When you left fellowship, you went to a really busy practice. Was that right? That was your first job out of fellowship?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I joined a really, really big private practice, endocrinology practice, right out of fellowship. It was kind of one of those dream jobs. You think that you're going to do your whole life, and I got it. And I was so excited about it. And I learned so much there because it's actually the busiest private practice in the country.
Oh my God, same.
And so when you're graduating from fellowship, you're like, wow, that's like the dream. But then when you actually are in it, and for me, anyone who follows me on social or knows me knows that I like truly just love my patients. I love what I do. And I really love relationship-based medicine and caring for people more than, being someone who prescribes just medications, right? And so in that busy practice, I got so much experience. I really, really value that coming right out of training, because all of us who have been through medical training know that the real fellowship is that first few years in practice.
Yes, it's so true. It's like medicine's still somewhat an apprenticeship. You can only learn what you're exposed to. And sometimes you have to be exposed to the real stuff after training that you don't really see in an academic center all the time.
Yeah. And like just having that ability to make decisions on your own without someone overseeing you, that's really what makes you go back and read the guidelines over and over and over again, because you're so afraid to make a mistake and you don't have someone else, above you making sure that you don't make a mistake. So for that, I'm super grateful for having that experience and just having patients pouring into my office. But after a while, I realized that my place in medicine was really having relationships with my patients. And so I ultimately left after a couple of years to create a more patient-centered practice that I felt like my patients would thrive more and I would thrive more in.
Okay, this is fascinating, and I don't want you to gloss over it because you're acting like, oh, I just left to create this other practice that would be better. But that's a huge step. And in medicine, there's a lot of barriers against this sometimes, and there's a lot of doubt, and people will say, oh, that's not the traditional pathway for a woman to go start her own practice. That's a different model. Was this something you always thought about, or did it just come to you as you were in training? Is this something that you said, I'm going to do this, and you started doing it right away? Or did this build over time? Like, this decision is huge. And I've always been such an admiration of you for making this choice relatively early on in your career.
Oh, thank you. So it was a process for sure. In med school, my med school best friends will be like, oh yeah, I remember you used to talk about this like women's health clinic that you were thinking about opening. And that I actually wanted to do REI before I realized that I didn't belong in the OR. And so, and that's what my research was in medical school. And so I had kind of had this thought, but nothing too serious. And then when I was in practice, I just felt like there had to be a better way. I would have patients coming in, they would have long wait times. They would be happy when they saw me, but they were so unhappy with the entire structure of medical outpatient medicine or medicine in general. But, the wait times, not being able to get through, not being able to get their prescriptions filled, not having adequate access to their doctor. And I kind of looked around and I was like, this system is not going to fix itself. Right. I can either be like, a cog in the wheel and just keep doing this, or I'm going to have to change my own system. Or otherwise, I kind of looked around and I was like, or I'm going to turn into, the people that I saw 20 years ahead of me. And that's not really what I saw for myself. And at the same time, I'm a mom. I have 2 little kids. My husband's an ICU doctor. He has a really crazy, hectic schedule. And my son at the time was just born. He wasn't thriving. And I just knew that this was not going to work for my life long-term, for the life that I saw for myself and for my patients. And so I really had to make a change. And I had a couple of options. One was to be a stay-at-home mom after a million years of training. And I just didn't want that for myself. I really love what I do. And I felt like I had just gotten out of training. I didn't want to quit at that point.
Just give it all up right away.
Exactly. And my other option was to find another way. And so I just decided, well, I've got to make a change. I have to do something. And let's see if any patients want to join me on this fun adventure that I'm taking. And I was very fortunate that, I had some belief in myself because pretty soon after I joined my big practice, I had, 5-10 patients changing physicians over to me from other physicians in the group. And so I was like, okay, I have something here. And patients would like talk to each other in the waiting room. And then they were supposed to see another doctor. And then somehow they'd get added onto my schedule because another patient, because they spent like 3 hours in the waiting room. They had time to talk to each other. To chat
to each other. And they understood you offered something a little different, right? A different approach.
Mm-hmm. And so I had people, people wanting to see me, which was kind of, as a young woman, like I'm a tiny person, a young woman of color, like that people were choosing to see over the more typical gray-haired old man doctor. And I was like, okay, well, people are looking for something different. And so just kind of reading the market a little bit, I was like, maybe I have something to offer here that other people don't, or that is specific to me that I can offer people. And then I also started looking at people's copays. So when we're in training, we don't learn anything about the finances of medicine.
Nothing. Not a thing at all.
Not a thing. And sometimes the things that we think are true are totally not true. Like, for example, there are some insurances that don't even pay for a person to see a specialist. Like they don't pay at all until maybe their entire deductible is met, or and they're only specific specialists. So people were coming to see me and my partners for like a 10, 15, sometimes 3-5 minute appointment and paying hundreds and hundreds of dollars for that. And then on top of it, the labs and all of this stuff. So I started doing some research and I was like, I can create a membership-based model with transparent pricing, tell people what they're going to pay up front and save them like thousands of dollars and also give them better service. And
I love this part so much. And I think there's a lot of confusion about different practice models, membership-based options, direct care, concierge medicine. And I think people would love it if you want to clear up a little bit of what is all out there if you start looking at, let's say, non-traditional options versus just where your insurance may be sending you.
Yeah. So I think it's important for everybody to look out for themselves in a way in the world of healthcare, because sometimes insurance isn't best. And by best, I mean quality of service and also cost wise. And so my practice is direct care. And so it has some crossover with concierge medicine, but there's some kind of key distinguishing parts. So in concierge medicine, which has been around for a really long time, basically you pay a retainer to keep that physician as your doctor, but that clinic also bills your insurance. So they bill your office visit, any procedures they do. They also bill your insurance for labs, all of that stuff. So there's really no cost savings associated with it directly, except that you're probably going to get better care and better access to your doctor, which in the long term could lead to cost savings. But there's no like upfront cost savings. Now, direct care is different from concierge medicine in that we don't bill any insurance. So we have a monthly membership fee, which is similar to like a concierge doctor's retainer, but we don't bill insurance for anything. And the reason that that's beneficial to both me and my patients is that enables us to keep costs lower, because paying for medical billing is another cost to your doctor.
It's like a whole body or team, depending on what you do.
Exactly. And so that cost gets translated to the patients who are having their billing done that way. So this is much more straightforward. And then also I have negotiated discounted lab pricing and imaging pricing for my patients. So my contracted rates are with LabCorp. So for example, if my patient gets a CMP, a TSH, all of these labs, I can say, hey, the cash price is this. It's typically about 10 times cheaper with my cash pricing than it is with most people's insurance. If it's cheaper with me than your insurance, use me. If not, use your insurance.
Who cares?
Either way is fine.
Either one works.
But at least it gets people to recognize, oh, I actually have options here. Like there is a way for me to find out which is cheaper. And I'll tell you, 99% of my patients use my pricing because it's so much cheaper than insurance. And so people actually end up saving as much as they spend on the membership that my physician fees in labs.
It's so interesting. And we could do the whole podcast talking about practice models and insurance, but we'll just talk about this one point before we pivot to some endocrine topics. Often people feel very married to their insurance company. Oh, my insurance company says I have to go here or I have to go here to get the best price. And it's not always actually the best price. And it's not always, and often not, the best level of care if they're directing you to go somewhere. That is your decision to make. But I always tell people, explore all your options. Like for us in IVF, some places, they'll take your insurance, but insurance excludes half of IVF anyway. So you're not really saving money when you put all these different things together. And the drugs, if you self-bought your IVF drugs, it costs about 1/3 is what your insurance company is going to charge you for them. So it's like you go through your benefit a lot faster. It's just important to understand that insurance companies overall don't usually put the patient at the top of their pyramid of goals, and they put money. And so that is translated often into the decisions they force you into. So as you said, I love what you said, Arti, be an advocate for yourself, understand what your options are so that there is transparency and you can choose what practice, no matter what we're talking about, is going to fit you the best and give you the best care.
Yeah, absolutely. And I believe so much in the cash model that even for me and my kids, actually my husband too is on my insurance in quotes. We use a cost share system called Sedera, and I pay cash for everything. And it saves me about $10,000 a year in premiums. And so since I'm saving that much, if I have to take my kid to the pediatrician and pay $150, it doesn't really bother me because I saved $1,400 in a premium that month.
Right.
So it's just kind of shifting your mindset about how you think about healthcare and how you think about paying for it.
I love it. So let's shift gears into a few endocrine topics. So let's start with yours and my favorite. That probably our biggest overlap in practice is going to be the thyroid. I see so many people coming in blaming their thyroid. Oh, my thyroid must be off. Oh, it's my thyroid. And granted, a lot of people do actually have thyroid abnormalities. Is this a big part of your practice, taking care of patients with thyroid disease? And what do you want people to know about it?
Yeah, absolutely. So after diabetes, thyroid is definitely the number 2 organ that I deal with. And I think, as physicians in endocrinology and dealing with hormones, sometimes we get frustrated because yes, everybody does kind of want to blame their thyroid for a lot of these nonspecific symptoms. But also there's a lot of information about the thyroid out there. And so if you're doing a Google search, you can't really blame people for being confused about the thyroid because there's tons of non-evidence-based providers putting a lot of information out there that can be really, really confusing. And so I always try to step back and remember, okay, it's confusing to be a patient. It's really hard it's confusing for physicians. I had a physician patient who's a cardiologist, totally confused about his thyroid, and he has hypothyroidism. And so it's confusing for even people with a really high education level.
Give an overview. So give the couple minute spiel about thyroid hormones. Like when you check your thyroid hormones, what are we checking and how do they interact? Because I think one of the most confusing things is that we check a hormone not made by the thyroid to see how the thyroid is functioning, right? We're looking at how is your brain interpreting your thyroid levels. And because that is opposite of what we call the diseases, I see people confused on this all the time. So I'd love to hear your take on the brief explanation about thyroid hormones and what we test.
Yeah. So that is super confusing. It's like we use backwards numbers to diagnose hypo and hyperthyroidism. So the thyroid is this beautiful butterfly-shaped gland in your neck that produces.
I love you. It's beautiful butterfly shape. It's like me and the ovaries.
It's the most beautiful gland in the body from my perspective, but that's up for debate. So it secretes thyroid hormones, T4 that peripherally gets converted to T3. But then in your brain, there is a small but mighty gland called the pituitary gland. And I say it's like me because it's small but mighty. And it secretes something called TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. And it does just that. The pituitary stimulates the thyroid using TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, to make thyroid hormones. So when the thyroid is broken, for example, due to hypothyroidism from Hashimoto's, which is the most common thyroid disease that we see. And that's an autoimmune disease where there are antibodies called thyroid peroxidase antibodies and thyroglobulin antibodies that attack the thyroid until eventually it doesn't function to make those thyroid hormones anymore. The brain starts to scream at the thyroid because it senses that there's not enough thyroid hormone around. So it screams with its loud voice of TSH to try to stimulate the thyroid, but the thyroid isn't listening because it's broken. And so TSH gets higher and higher and higher, but the thyroid hormone is still low. And that's when we need synthetic thyroid hormone supplementation. So for you science people out there, it's a negative feedback loop. But for everybody else, basically, the thyroid is controlled by the brain, and that's the hormone we check because it is the most sensitive lab test that we have for thyroid hormones. Now, people say, well, why don't you check free T3? Why don't you care about the thyroid direct hormones? And it's not that I don't care about them, it's just the assays. So if I had a wonderful commercially available free T3 assay available that I could send my patients to LabCorp and get for a reasonable price, I would totally be all about getting that, but I don't at this time. TSH is the most sensitive lab test that we have. Now, there are free T3 assays available in the lab, that we can do in, research experiments and stuff, but they're not available to everyone. So that's why we rely so heavily on the TSH.
I love that explanation. So when we check TSH, it's the opposite of what's going on with your thyroid. So when TSH is high, it's because the thyroid is broken and not listening. Therefore, that's hypothyroid. Thyroid's making low thyroid hormones. And on the opposite, when the thyroid gland is really overactive and too excited, it's overproducing, then your brain has low TSH because it's saying, hey, don't send out any. We've got enough. Stop production.
Exactly.
But the thyroid gland is not listening. And so that's one of the number one questions I get is, but the TSH, and people don't really understand just because nobody was able maybe to explain it in a way that makes sense. And I love how you put it. I have a question about Hashimoto. So I get asked all the time, and I'm sure you have some general recommendations for people who have Hashimoto's or autoimmune disease. Is there anything lifestyle-wise you recommend besides getting on thyroid hormone? We're going to say that's a yes. You're going to start your thyroid hormone because your brain is telling us you need it. But are there other changes that you feel like help certain people who have autoimmune disease?
So I think generally a healthful lifestyle is beneficial. I know you and I both recommend plant-focused or plant-forward diets. And so I think that's a great way. Exercise, stress management, good sleep, all of those things. Now, is there a specific diet that is evidence-based and recommended for Hashimoto's? No. Will you find a million if you ask Google? Yes. And so there's a few things that people have questions about all the time, like selenium. So selenium is used for thyroid hormone synthesis, but do you need to take a selenium supplement? Not really. Usually we get sufficient amounts in our diet. If you really want to boost your selenium, you could eat like 5 Brazil nuts a month and you get sufficient selenium for your thyroid. Also, people ask about iodine all the time. Most of us are getting sufficient iodine from iodized salt, and you don't need that much to get sufficient iodine. And fruits and veggies grown in the US have iodine in them. Most of us don't need an iodine supplement unless we're pregnant. And that's in most prenatal vitamins. And we definitely don't need whopping doses because whopping doses can unpredictably affect the thyroid and lead to profound hyper or hypothyroidism. So if there's a supplement that says thyroid supplement and it has like 1,000 micrograms of iodine, just run as far away from it as you can.
Just run away.
And then other common things are, how does soy affect the thyroid? So soy can impair the absorption of thyroid hormone supplementation. So if you are on a high soy diet and you are also on thyroid hormone supplementation, you might need a higher dose than you would if you weren't on a high soy diet, but it doesn't like make your hypothyroidism worse. And then another big thing is gluten. People talk about gluten all the time in thyroid. So there is no data to say that if you have Hashimoto's or hypothyroidism, you need to avoid gluten. Now, Hashimoto's is an autoimmune disease, and if you have one autoimmune disease, you're more likely to have another. And celiac disease is an autoimmune disease where you are gluten intolerant. So if you have Hashimoto's and celiac, then yes, you should avoid gluten. If you eat gluten and you feel crummy when you eat gluten, then you should probably also avoid gluten. But just because you have Hashimoto's, that doesn't mean that you should take gluten off the table.
I love it. Those are the top questions I get asked all the time by people. And I think because thyroid is it's pretty prevalent. I mean, there's a lot of people who do have thyroid abnormalities. And in my spectrum, thyroid abnormalities can cause abnormal bleeding, irregular periods, miscarriages. And so it's a hormone that we check all the time in our infertility patients as a screening test to make sure that we are checking the right things. Now, before we go into differences in pregnancy, quick question as far as when do people get their thyroid checked? Is this every year? Should it be every year for some people? Is there a certain age when you start getting it checked? Or what symptoms would somebody have that might make you say you should actually go get checked out for that?
Yeah, so usually people are checked first when they have symptoms. So the symptoms of hypothyroidism can be very nonspecific. So that's why the labs are very important. But common symptoms are fatigue, weight gain, and weight gain from true hypothyroidism is usually on the order of 10% of total body weight. So if you've gained like 100 pounds in the last year, it's not all due to your thyroid. It could be partially due to your thyroid, and usually it's water weight from hypothyroidism. Weight gain, constipation, dry skin, dry hair, brittle hair, hair loss around the temporal region, shortening of your eyebrows, depressed mood, kind of a generalized slowing down of the system are symptoms consistent with hypothyroidism. Hyperthyroidism is kind of the flip. So anxiety, insomnia, heat intolerance, cardiac arrhythmias, rapid heart rate, high blood pressure, those kinds of things. So if you're having symptoms like that, it is worthwhile to have your TSH checked. That's the most reliable screening lab. You don't need to have like 40 thyroid tests done. If the TSH is normal, those labs can just be confusing, really. And if you do have abnormal thyroid function, the frequency with testing kind of varies. So once you're on a stable regimen for hypothyroidism, like you're on a medication that is stable, you should be checked every year at least, and if you have new symptoms. Now, hyperthyroidism on the flip side, we usually check a little bit more frequently. And if, there are different types of causes of hyperthyroidism. Graves' disease is the most common. And if that doesn't go into remission after a year, we talk about definitive therapy, getting rid of the thyroid in some way to keep you safe.
Okay. So if you have any of those symptoms, a lot of them do kind of sound like pandemic symptoms, but I think it's important if you have a change from what your baseline is or something that is not getting better and progressing, that you bring it up to your doctor. And as you said, TSH is the best screening test. And so that's the metric by what we use. In my world now, what confuses people a ton is that they could go see you, not tell you that you're trying to get pregnant, just get a little checkup, have a TSH done and it's in the normal range. They come to me and they say, oh, I didn't tell her, but I've been trying to get pregnant for a year and I have infertility. And their TSH then is considered too high in my world. And this confuses people all the time. So I'll say the simplest way to put it is that your thyroid gland increases production. It needs to increase production of thyroid hormones by about 30% the moment you get pregnant. And that is really important in the first trimester because a fetus doesn't make any thyroid hormones until at least 11 weeks. So we are relying on mom to have enough thyroid hormone going around to help support the baby's growth. And this is really essential for development of the child and for brain development and a lot of reasons. So if your thyroid is borderline, meaning your TSH is already high, your brain's already telling your thyroid gland to work hard, even if it's in the high end of that normal range, I'm now afraid that the moment you get pregnant, you have a 30% increase in demand, you're not going to be able to keep up because you're already working your thyroid gland at the high end of what it can before it poops out. And so we really like to get a TSH less than 2.5, which is kind of in the middle of the range of what would really be considered normal for anybody who's had infertility, if you're having abnormal bleeding, you're trying to get pregnant. Those are the values we're shooting for. That way, when you get pregnant and you have that increased demand, you're able to accommodate this. And that also means that many people get put on thyroid hormone and it gets actively managed through your pregnancy. So even when you leave me and go to your regular OBGYN, we'll all work together to make sure your thyroid hormone is appropriate in the first trimester, second, third, and postpartum. And some people end up having true Hashimoto's disease that gets diagnosed in this time period and they're on medication forever. Some people, this is just transient. When they're not in the pregnancy stage, they're able to be off medication and then they're fine. But I find that that's really confusing for most people about, well, why did my doctor say this is normal, but you're telling me I need to start a medication?
Yeah, I think that was great explanation. And I think people do get super confused there. So HCG normally stimulates more thyroid hormone production. So it's normal physiology for a woman when she gets pregnant to make more thyroid hormone. And what I think you were trying to say is that we're just trying to make sure that you get that extra thyroid hormone, because we're not 150% sure that your body is going to make that extra thyroid hormone when you get pregnant. So we want to support the pregnancy. And I think us as endocrinologists are totally on board with that. So I think a key piece of this puzzle is, if you're trying to get pregnant, tell your endocrinologist.
Yes, tell everybody. I mean, I think that's actually really important, because especially in the infertility population, nobody wants to admit they're having a hard time. So perhaps you're seeing your endocrinologist who's been managing your thyroid forever. This literally just happened to me, and a patient I'm doing an embryo transfer on really soon, and her endocrinologist just adjusted their dose. And typically I want your dose stable before we start this cycle. If you need last minute dose adjustments, I'm not convinced this is the perfect time to go put an embryo in. But her endocrinologist did not know she's undergoing IVF and an embryo transfer, because she felt, this shame and the stigma of infertility and didn't bring it up. And this is why it's really important to know that we're all on the same team and we're here to help you. And even though those things may be hard to talk about, it really may impact your medical care. And so I think it's really essential to have those open communications and tell your doctor if you're undergoing fertility treatments or trying to get pregnant. Even if it's not your fertility doctor or your OBGYN, it can matter.
Yeah, absolutely. And, if there is an issue, like, I take care of people with gestational diabetes, or people with infertility, or people who just went through fertility treatments. I'm always okay with picking up the phone and calling your doctor to get us on the same page if it doesn't seem like we're on the same page, because sometimes it just takes that doctor to doctor communication to say, hey, okay, this is what's going on. This was what I was thinking. Okay, this is what I was thinking. And then we can kind of relay a better message to you, our patient, to make it less confusing for you and for us too.
I was like, we're not afraid to talk to each other. So I think that's always get your doctors on the same team, because we want to be, but you're the connecting dot. So as you said earlier, advocate for yourself. That way we can make sure that everybody's pushing the boat in the same direction and advocating for your needs.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, I wanted to say one more thing about thyroid and pregnancy. So as an endocrinologist, if I know that you're trying to get pregnant or you are pregnant, there are no adverse effects of hyperthyroidism for the most part in pregnancy. So if your OB or your RE is telling us that we need to add thyroid hormone, I will more than likely defer to them on that, because the risk of hypo is much more dangerous to the fetus than hyper. So if you're pregnant or trying to get pregnant, err on the side of being on thyroid hormone or increasing your dose.
I'm so glad you said that. Yeah, I would rather have somebody run a little bit hyperthyroid, meaning their TSH is really in that low range, as long as they're asymptomatic, because then I do feel 150% confident that they've got enough thyroid hormone circulating around to support their body in that pregnancy the moment that HCG production starts. So if you can tolerate it, we like that, because it's a little bit safer and it's not as much wiggle room if you forget one dose or something else like that happens.
Yeah.
If we switch gears for a moment, I know I don't have you all day. We could just talk forever, but diabetes. So I don't really take care of patients with diabetes. Certainly in patients with PCOS or who are overweight and have risk factors, I will screen them to see if they have diabetes. I see a ton of insulin resistance, and we talk a lot about lifestyle strategies for that. Talk a lot about metformin, but I send a ton of patients on to medical endocrine to help us with insulin resistance or a new diagnosis of diabetes. And I know this is, as you already said, the number one thing that you see and you take care of. So I'm sure you have some pointers for people or thoughts about, especially for that middle of the road insulin resistant patient who is, if they change nothing, going to likely progress into diabetes. Do you want to tell people what diabetes is and then give us some insulin resistance tips?
Yeah. So there are multiple types of diabetes. But I think the one that we deal with most commonly is type 2 diabetes, which is caused by insulin resistance. So I'll talk mostly about that. But of course, we have type 1 diabetes, which is an autoimmune condition where the body doesn't produce sufficient insulin. And then we have some other types of diabetes like MODIs and pancreatogenic diabetes. But to keep it simple, we'll talk mostly about type 2. So type 2 diabetes is caused by something called insulin resistance. So what that means is your body, your pancreas, which is an organ in the middle of your abdomen that's responsible for lots of things, but producing insulin to combat your blood sugar from getting too high is one of the major roles of the pancreas. So basically, the pancreas is working really hard to produce insulin, but your body is not processing that insulin properly and not utilizing it properly to do the things that it's supposed to do. And oftentimes that's due to excess fat in the diet or excess body fat or a combination of both. And there's also other factors like PCOS causes it, genetic factors, environmental factors, all kinds of things. But excessive fat that you eat or that you wear are major causes of insulin resistance. And so what insulin normally does is when the blood sugar gets high, it opens up a door and the blood sugar gets pushed into the muscles or the cells to be used as energy. Now, when we're resistant to insulin, the sugar gets stuck. It gets stuck in the bloodstream and the body can't use it properly for energy. And the sugar starts to rise and we end up with prediabetes or diabetes. And the problem with this is then in response, the insulin starts getting higher and higher and higher. The insulin level starts getting higher and higher and higher. And while insulin is a very necessary hormone in normal levels, when it gets too high, it makes us gain more weight. So we get into this vicious cycle of insulin resistance, high insulin levels, weight gain, worsen insulin resistance. And we really need to take steps in those scenarios to make it stop and move our bodies from insulin resistant to more insulin sensitive. And so there's a few ways that I recommend my patients, but really everybody in their life can start thinking about this because it's never really too early and it's never too late to start thinking about, your chronic metabolic health. And so one thing, of course, is diet. So making sure you're not getting excessive calories, one, but I recommend a plant-forward diet. So a diet that's rich in fruits, veggies, whole grains, legumes, and low in processed foods, excess saturated fat. But I like to say that, yes, this is a diet that I recommend, but I'm a dietary agnostic. Like, I don't want to propose a diet to people that isn't going to work for them. So right. Whatever gets you in the right direction, if you're eating McDonald's every day, then, not eating McDonald's one day a week is progress for you, And so I don't want it can be very off-putting sometimes to say you have to eat plants only to somebody who is like a cattle rancher, right? But if we can say, and I actually have patients that are like farmers, they we live in Texas, right? And so, but what we can say is, yes, you can have meat as maybe your side dish or, have a salad with it, just making progress to have a more healthful diet is what it's about. It's not about. Yeah.
I say the same thing. I say, plant focus, plant forward, but maybe it's meatless Monday, or maybe you pick one meal at least during the day that meal doesn't have meat in it. So you're being forced to include more fruits and vegetables, because one thing that happens, and I know I'll keep going, is that when people eat a lot of meat, they're not eating a lot of vegetables. And there's an inverse correlation because they're getting full on the meat and that saturated fat. And then they're not consuming those vitamin and nutrient dense vegetables as much. At least most of my patients who eat a lot of meat, that's what I'm seeing in them.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you don't have to completely turn your life around overnight to see great leaps and bounds in your metabolic health. I mean, I have patients who I literally have had patients come off 100 units of insulin in 3 days.
That's fabulous.
It's amazing how just kind of reframing the way you think about food. And most of my patients aren't 100% vegan. I mean, most of them are just eating better than they were before. And so it's really possible to make huge leaps in your metabolic health with some baby steps, just putting one foot in front of the other every day in the way of diet. And then another thing that really improves insulin sensitivity is exercise. So there was one study in insulin-resistant adults where one bout of 45 minutes on the elliptical immediately improved their insulin sensitivity. And I see this in my patients with diabetes on continuous glucose monitors all the time. Like when they exercise, all of a sudden their blood sugars are down for like the next 24 hours. So exercise makes a big difference. And a couple of things that we don't talk about enough, but sleep makes a big difference on insulin resistance. It affects your cortisol levels, and cortisol is a hormone that affects insulin resistance quite significantly. And so getting your good 7 to 9 hours of restful sleep a night can improve your metabolic health. Making sure you're not dealing with untreated sleep apnea can make a big difference. And managing stress, because stress raises your cortisol levels as well. That can make a big difference in your ability to be sensitive to insulin, but also your chronic metabolic disease risk. And I see a lot of people for obesity or overweight, and they're so stressed and they're not sleeping, and they're like, my weight isn't moving. And I'm like, yeah, well, of course it's not moving, because you have these other hormonal factors playing a role that we need to target first. So a lot of my patients, we address sleep first more before we do anything else, because it's hard to make diet changes and exercise changes if you aren't dealing with your best decision-making capacity without good sleep.
I think this is so important. And as you said, for everybody, not just people who are insulin resistant or actively have diabetes, but for all of us to be healthier and prevent ourselves from getting insulin resistant, because that becomes a cycle that is harder to break. And I love these ways you've told us to break it. So if I summarize it down, when you eat food, food has sugar in it. The sugar usually goes into your cells and is used as energy. But an insulin is what helps it get inside the cells. So what happens is that when you have a lot of sugar, you become insulin resistant. The insulin keeps rising higher and higher, trying to get the sugar into the cells. And there's a mismatch. It's not happening. And so you get stuck in this pathway where your cells and organs aren't using insulin the way it wants to. The body's raising insulin up, which is then telling your body to store everything as fat because it's worried that you're not going to get enough, right? So you get into this cycle. And good ways to break it include sleep, number one, ways to mitigate stress so you can lower your cortisol levels, starting a more plant-focused diet, but essentially also eliminating processed foods, extra sugars, things like that, and exercise. Even moderate, low impact exercise is important, right? It doesn't have to go be a HIIT or a high intensity class. It can be something manageable, like walking outside or on an elliptical. It doesn't have to be something really intense, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I have a whole video on that because, I feel like I've said it so many times that it's kind of, I know it like the back of my hand. And my husband is a physician. And when I first explained insulin resistance to him, he was like, wait, what? Say that again? And he stopped me like 15 times. And so I was like, I should put a video online about this so that when I tell people, they can go back and listen to it because it's more complex than I remember.
Is the video on YouTube or is it on your website? Where do people find the video?
Yeah, you can find it on my website. There's a patient resources section, but also on my YouTube channel.
Okay. Last question before we kind of wrap it up. I've loved having you here. Is that I see a lot of patients who go to a different provider. So we'll say not a medical endocrinologist and not an RE, and they'll have the most extensive hormone panel done I've ever seen. And they've paid out of pocket for it and cost them thousands of dollars. And sometimes they're put on various supplements / medications that are not evidence-based. And I never blame a person or a patient for doing this, because I understand this is a sign that they're not getting what they needed from their current healthcare provider and they're searching for answers. And this was the pathway that felt the most comfortable for them. But I've seen some scary things done where patients, in premature ovarian failure were put on iodine drops and not estrogen like they needed. And young girls with osteoporosis or amenorrhea not worked up appropriately. And so I think there's some caution, especially when you're spending thousands for that type of care. And I know you've seen things like that too. So are there red flags to people or things to look out for when it comes to who's managing your hormones and what that means?
Yeah. So yes, I see this all the time. And I think it's a sad situation because people are looking for solutions and they're not getting the solutions that they need in these like 5-minute doctor PCP or endocrinologist visits that are the norm these days. And so I never think it's the patient's fault. I actually don't think it's the patient's fault at all. It's just they're looking for solutions. And what I would say is make sure that your doctor has an MD or DO behind their name and that they're board certified in the specialty that they are treating you for.
That's key. That's key right there.
So if you're looking for hormonal treatment, make sure they're an endocrinologist or an RE. And then also, some of these people are acupuncturists, they're chiropractors, they're people who really don't have a prescribing authority. And so if somebody can't prescribe a medication, but they can sell you supplements because those aren't regulated, that's a huge red flag. So if somebody is diagnosing you with a medical condition and prescribing supplements that aren't sold at a pharmacy, you can buy them on Amazon or you buy them from that clinic, that's a red flag in my book. And I've seen some of these tests done. They're so expensive. I mean, they're thousands and thousands of dollars. And there are people who have like non-degrees who are charging 10 times what I charge for my patients. And I think it's really hard in the world of social media to avoid that, but just kind of make sure that the doctor is board certified and is really a doctor. In the way of thyroid, we see this a lot. And, thyroid is hard because a lot of people feel that they're not getting the adequate, but people aren't hearing them when they're telling them about their issues. And that's a real concern. But the problem is we see a lot of patients end up in the hospital with things like atrial fibrillation or thyrotoxicosis or really bad life-threatening conditions from thyroid hormone mismanagement. And I see patients who are put on adrenal supplements for adrenal fatigue, which is not a real condition. And these adrenal supplements have like cow adrenal in them. And so they actually cause what we call iatrogenic adrenal insufficiency, which is actually can be fatal if you stop the supplements. And so these aren't just like minor little supplements that are, people think like supplements are natural, so they can't cause problems, but that's not the case. Supplements, they may be natural, like from a pig or a plant or something, but that doesn't mean that they're safe. And so you really want to be using a doctor who has a medical license and who has some liability, because there's a lot of people out there selling a lot of things that aren't safe.
I think that's so important. And again, you and I both have the same perspective here. We understand that when patients are seeking alternative providers, they're just looking for good care and they haven't been able to get it in a traditional system. But you and I would both rather them come to us than come to a board certified physician who spent most of her really good years in training and took lots of board exams and understands the difference. I like to use supplements. I like to use diet. I like to use medications, but I know when to use what, and I know what not to use. And I think that, and you're the same way. And I think that's so important because often if something sounds too good to be true, it likely is. If we could just give a little supplement to all these medical conditions, we would do it. It would be much easier. But it's really hard in the time of social media because often we get painted as the bad guy, or somebody's experience with traditional medicine hasn't been so good. And so they group everybody together. So my kind of piece of advice is advocate for yourself and find that physician who's right for you, because I promise we're out there, especially in the world of telemedicine.
Yeah. And also, sometimes I feel like these providers who are providing these therapies in quotations, I feel like they actually don't know what they're doing. Like they don't, not in a way, I mean,
they're not trying to hurt you, but they don't necessarily know the difference.
Exactly. They're not trying to hurt you, and they don't know the potential toxicity of what they're prescribing. Because, for example, like functional medicine, it can be an online certificate where those providers who claim that they know more than your endocrinologist do an online training of 18 hours. And that's
18 hours.
18 hours. And that's like in comparison to my 8,000 hours of fellowship of clinical experience, multiple board exams, it just doesn't even compare. The training doesn't even compare. And so it's impossible for them to know endocrinology and hormones in as much depth and detail to be prescribing the things that you don't know. And someone smart once told me that the most dangerous thing for a physician is what you don't know that you don't know. And I think that a lot of these providers are in that boat.
Oh, I totally agree with that. Arti, I've loved having you on. I'll have to have you back on so we can dive into more of this some other time. But if you would please tell everybody where to find you if they want to be a patient and where they can find you online.
Yeah, absolutely. So my website is www.sacomplete.com. I see patients virtually for all of Texas. And you can find my videos, resources for patients on that website as well. And then you can find me on Instagram. My handle is at Dr. Arti Thangudu, so just my name. And then I also have a YouTube channel with lots of educational content on insulin resistance, thyroid, adrenals coming up, testosterone, all kinds of things. And it's just Dr. Arti Thangudu there too.
I love it. Everybody go to YouTube and follow Arti so you can get more information about how your body works. Thank you, Arti.
Thank you so much.
All right. I hope you guys enjoyed that conversation as much as I enjoyed recording it. I think we'll definitely have to have Arti back on and talk more about things like testosterone, pituitary glands, menopause, and all of that stuff. As always, you can follow me on Instagram at nataliecrawfordmd. You can find more fertility-centered YouTube videos at nataliecrawfordmd. And I am so thankful to have you here. Review, share, subscribe, all the things. Those things mean so much to me. Thanks, friends.
My name is Len Webb.
And I'm Vincent Williams.
We'd like to welcome you to our documentary podcast, The Class of 1989. Over the course of 6 episodes, Vincent and I will examine the importance of 6 Black films that came out in '89 and how they shaped and influenced popular culture, filmmaking, and society in general.
Come on, sucker. Let's get it on.
New episodes will begin running weekly on March 6th.